Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a time you've probably never learned about in school. Not quite cavemen, not quite farmers. This was the in-between, the long forgotten stretch of human history after the last great hunts and before the first cities ever rose. It was a time of strange tools, silent migrations, hidden burial sites, and rules we still don't understand. It's not the Stone Age you think you know, and if you were dropped into this world today, you wouldn't last a single season. So get comfortable, because this is the story of what came before civilization, the world your ancestors barely survived. And if you enjoy this kind of deep, dreamy dive into overlooked history, be sure to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Now let's begin. Where the last spears fell silent. You're asleep beside a fire, but it's not the kind of fire you've ever known. It flickers from a low circle of cracked stones, sheltered under the rim of a rock overhang, blackened by generations of soot. The flames don't dance brightly. They cling to the last bits of kindling like they're afraid of the dark. Your body is wrapped in a hide, worn thin at the edges, patched more than once with sinew. Beside you are the soft exhalations of others, maybe 10 people, maybe 20. No one counts, not exactly. You know them all by face, by smell, by the way their feet sound in the grass. You don't need numbers. There's no village here, no tents, just a few windbreaks of brush and stone. You don't own the land, you don't even think of it as land. It's just where the herd was last seen, and so it's where you sleep. You rise early, not because you want to, but because the sun presses its heat across your eyes, and the smoke from the fire is drifting too thick. Your joints ache, your feet are cracked. You stretch silently, grab your satchel, and walk toward the trees. Your spear is heavier than it used to be. The shaft is older, repaired many times. It's been passed between people, older cousins, uncles, friends who didn't come back. The point is stone. You once had a bone-tipped spear, but it snapped clean through when you missed a running elk and hit a rock. This weapon is your entire life. It's food, it's protection, it's identity. And one day soon, maybe too soon, it will be buried with you in a shallow mound near a river, where others will one day find it and wonder who you were. You step carefully. The grass is wet. The woods are quiet in a way that makes you nervous. Not peaceful, just watchful. Something is different. The game has moved. You haven't seen the old herds in days. The trail is thinner now. Tracks are older. Scat is dry. You've heard the elders mutter at night that something is wrong. Maybe the wind shifted. Maybe the gods are angry. Or maybe the animals are simply learning. They adapt too. You don't know how much longer your group can last like this, but you also don't know there's another way. Later that day you find something odd, something that leaves a silence behind your ribs, a circle of stones, not for fire, for marking, with a pile of ash and bones in the center, and what looks like carved shell pieces strung together on a stick, upright in the dirt. You've never seen anything like it. You crouch, breath shallow. This wasn't your group. This wasn't anyone you know, but the site is too recent to be ancient. Someone has passed through here, someone not like you. They didn't follow the herds. They left signs, symbols, decoration. You feel something uncomfortable press into your stomach. Not fear, something older, something ancestral. A feeling that the world is beginning to shift beneath your bare feet. When you return, the others are sharpening points, boiling roots, arguing softly. You say nothing of what you saw, but the next day you catch someone else staring at the horizon, not in hunger, but in thought. That night, the elders speak, not in stories, but in uncertainty. The hunt is harder now. Fewer returns, more losses. The rivers run lower. The weather is strange. They speak of a far-off land where people dig in the earth, stay in one place, plant strange things. You're not sure what planting means. Seeds are eaten, buried seeds are wasted. Still, you listen. One of the younger women has a vision, she says. A place with fields and fences, with walls. The others laugh, gently. But not everyone is laughing. There's a boy, barely grown, who doesn't go on the next hunt. He lingers behind, says his ankle is twisted, but you see him later, dragging stones into a circle near the stream, trying to shape the ground. You don't understand it, but something inside you twists. He's building something, not just for today, but for tomorrow. The next month, you return to the valley where you first slept. Only it isn't yours anymore. A small group has settled there, shelters of woven branches, stored meat, clay bowls. They don't move. They trade. They dig. They point at your spear, like it belongs to another time. They offer you something round and yellow, Bitter but warm, cooked, you take it, eat, listen, stay a while longer than you should. That night, beside the fire, you stare at your spear across your lap. It's old, heavy, still sharp, but you wonder for the first time if it might one day be quiet, hung on a wall, maybe, buried in earth, no longer wild, a symbol of what you used to be. And just like that, without war, without orders, without understanding, the age of the hunter begins to slip away. The spears will fall silent, not because they were defeated, but because the hands that held them found something else to hold. The earth itself is changing, and soon you will too. The path of forgotten footprints. The wind is gentler now, but the silence is deeper than before. You're walking again. Not because you were forced to, but because that's what your people do. You've never known what it's like to stop, to stay. The rhythm of your life isn't built on calendars or clocks. It's built on steps, on distance, on instinct. There's no trail, not really. The dirt is soft in places, hard in others. Sometimes the grass hides the way, sometimes the animals do. You learn to follow signs so small that others wouldn't even see them. Broken twigs, scraped bark, a depression in the moss where someone once rested. These aren't new skills. They were passed to you long before you had words for them. Generations walked this way, and left nothing behind but the shape of memory. The path is made not of direction, but of experience, and it's fading. Each year, fewer footprints return, not because people are dying, but because they're staying, stopping, building. You've heard of it from others, across the ridgeline, down the river, beyond the low hills. There are families who sleep beneath woven roofs and don't rise with the herd's call. They place stones in the ground and call it protection. They move less, they dig more. You've never met them, but their footprints are spreading. They walk differently, heavier, slower, like the earth is pulling them in. You find one of their traces near a narrow stream, a line of stones set in a pattern. They didn't fall that way by chance. They've been arranged carefully, maybe to guide water, maybe to guide something else. A few paces further, a strange clay shape, half buried, round, with a hollow inside. Not for eating, not for carrying, just placed. You don't know why. You hold it in your hand and feel its weight. It's heavier than it should be, not just in stone, but in purpose. Someone made this thing without needing it to survive. That feels foreign, and a little dangerous, because when you live by the hunt, there's no time for anything that doesn't serve your next step. But this was made for something else. You leave it behind, but it stays in your mind. That night, someone in your group tells an old story. You've heard it before. It's about a woman who followed a bear for 10 days and 10 nights, only to find a place so full of honey and roots that she never came back. Some say she died there, others say she was the first to settle. You used to laugh at it, now you're not so sure. In the days that follow, you notice your own group walking differently. They linger longer at the water's edge. The fire is made in the same place 2 nights in a row. Someone builds a lean-to that doesn't get taken down in the morning. When you were younger, this would have been unthinkable. Fires must vanish, tools must be packed, signs must be hidden. The forest watches everything. Stay too long, and you invite trouble, either from predators or from spirits. But now, even the elders are slower to leave. There's an ache behind your ribs, low and strange. It's not fear, not hunger, it's something deeper, change. You wake one morning to find a new set of footprints beside your own. They weren't made by your group. Smaller feet, softer tread. You follow them, cautiously, down a slope of loose stone and dried grass. At the base is a figure, alone, a boy, maybe 12 or 13 summers old, holding something odd. It's a net, not the kind for fish. It's been woven, tightly, in a strange shape. He doesn't see you at first. He's setting a trap, not for game, for birds. You step quietly forward. He hears your footfall, looks up, and freezes. For a long moment, you both stand there, unmoving. Then he nods, barely, not afraid, not curious either, just calm, like he's done this before. You nod back. He turns, walks away, silently, at a path you hadn't noticed. His footprints vanish into dry reeds, gone. But that moment stays with you for seasons. You don't tell the others. Time moves slowly, not in hours or days, but in migrations, cycles, gut feelings. When the sky begins to change color earlier in the evening, you know the turn is near. Autumn, they call it now. You just call it the time of hiding. Fewer animals, more wind, darker mornings. But something's different this year. The cold bites sharper. The rivers retreat faster. You've always known how to live with hardship, but this one lingers. It's not just a bad season. It's a slow shift. You begin to understand why people are settling. It isn't just for comfort. It's for survival. A woman in your group is pregnant. She struggles to walk now. Each morning she sits longer before moving. At night, her partner sleeps closer, speaking low songs. No one says it out loud, but you all know what's coming. The next day, you stop walking. Not far, just near a bend in the river, with thick trees and stone overhang. You say it's just for a few nights, just until the birth. But you begin gathering wood, making tools, reinforcing shelter. You build fire not for one night, but for many. There are tracks here, of deer, of boar, of rabbit. It feels like a good place. You set your spear down beside your bedroll. You don't pick it up the next morning. You don't realize it yet. But your footprints are no longer a path. They are a pattern. Elsewhere, others are doing the same. The boy with the net, the families who dig, the quiet people who plant. You will not meet most of them, but your lives are already linked. The trail is disappearing, not because it was forgotten, but because it is no longer needed. You are not walking toward the future anymore. You're staying where it will find you, and the footprints you leave now will not fade with the rain. How we lived without names. You don't have a name. Not in the way we use them now. Not the way they get written, remembered, or shouted across a field. You are known by the sound of your step, the shape of your sleep, the way you hold a stone when you think no one is watching. You belong to a world where names haven't hardened yet, where nothing stays still long enough to need labeling, where identity isn't spoken, it's understood. The people around you don't say mother, or sister, or friend. They use glances, gestures, familiar rhythms, and the unspoken weight of shared firelight. You've grown beside these people like trees in a thicket, separate yet leaning. You've held each other through frost and famine, through bear tracks too close to camp, and through quiet, sacred moments where someone places a carved pebble into someone else's hand, and no one asks why. In this life, you are not one person. You are part of a weaving, a pattern so old it doesn't remember how it started. Your days are built on motion, not because you're restless, but because stillness is unnatural. The world was not meant to be held in place. The sun moves, so you move. The animals move, so you follow. The wind changes, and you bend with it. You wake with the scent of damp ash in your hair and dirt pressed into the ridges of your fingers. You stretch slowly, your joints cracking softly, and rise into the morning chill. Someone else is already awake, fishing, maybe, or weaving a basket with reeds pulled from the nearby bank. No one speaks at first. Words are not necessary. The day begins like it always does, and always has. A child laughs somewhere, high and light, like water over stone. They're playing with a bone carved into the shape of a bird. Not a toy. Not really. Just something someone made one long evening, with time and thought, and the hush of fading firelight. That's how most things are made here. Not with plans, with presence. You help with the nets that morning. The river is wide, but gentle, curling slow through a narrow bend near the trees. The water is cold. You don't measure its depth, you feel it with your calves and guess from the pull of the current. You cast slowly, no rush. You've done this so many times, your body remembers more than your mind does. You let it. The fish come eventually, silver flashes in the woven netting, eyes round, bodies stiffening. You take what you need, nothing more. This idea, enough, isn't written anywhere. It isn't taught, it's simply known. The old woman with the bent spine doesn't eat as much now, so you bring her the softest root you've found. You chew it first, like she used to for you, long ago. She nods, doesn't smile, just rests her hand on your wrist. That's a kind of name too. In the middle of the day, it rains, not heavily, just a soft, steady mist. It beads on the hide stretched above your shelter and slides down the bark walls with a sound like whispering. You sit in the dim, carving a notch into a length of wood. You're not counting anything, just marking time, or maybe memory. You're not sure. Across the fire, someone is making thread from bark fiber, twisting, pulling, winding. It's slow, repetitive, calming. The kind of task that holds the mind in place while the heart thinks freely. You wonder sometimes what lies far beyond this forest. You've heard of plains so wide you can walk for days and never find a tree. You've heard of animals too large to hunt and too quiet to fear. You've heard of water that stretches beyond sight, but you've never been there, and no one here asks why. Names are dangerous things in a way. They make something permanent, and nothing in your life is permanent. Not the rivers, not the paths, not even the sky. Clouds move, stars shift, people are born, and people fade. When someone dies, they are not given a name to carry after. They are remembered in the way their hands moved, or the strange sound they made when they laughed, or the story they told about the bird who tricked the moon. Their spirit goes into the fire, their body into the ground, their memory into silence, and in the morning, you move on, not out of coldness, out of understanding. Life isn't about building monuments. It's about surviving gently, leaving as little behind as possible, so others can walk where you walked and still hear the wind. One evening, a visitor arrives, not from far, but not from here either. He carries a woven bag on his back, and walks with a staff carved in spirals. His clothes are strange, thicker than yours, dyed with something reddish, and stitched along the edges. He speaks with a different rhythm, slower in some places, faster in others. He sits by the fire, shares dried berries, listens more than he talks. He shows you something smooth and round, clay, shaped with care, a little cracked from the journey. It holds water, or grain, or maybe nothing. You pass it from hand to hand, not quite understanding its purpose. He tells you of others, people who live by rivers that don't dry, people who dig rows in the ground, and place seeds in them, people who don't chase animals anymore. Some in your group scoff, others grow quiet. You don't say anything, but the thought stays with you, not the object, not the story, the idea, that somewhere else people are choosing to stay, not because they can't move, because they don't need to. The visitor leaves the next day. You walk with him for a time, down the slope toward the river trail. You don't say goodbye. There's no word for that here. You simply nod, and he nods back, and then he disappears into the trees, leaving only faint, fading footprints. You watch until the last one blurs into the undergrowth. Then you turn and walk back to your people. The fire still burns low, the smoke still curls upward, and above it all, the wind carries no names, only memory. The river that refused to stay still. The river had always been there, not always in the same shape, or even the same place, but always close enough that your people knew its moods better than their own. It wasn't a river with a name. It didn't need one. It was simply the river, the one that moved when everything else seemed still. The one that fed and took, listened and swallowed. It never promised safety, only motion. You were young the first time it changed in front of you. Not all at once. There was no great flood or cracking noise. Just one day the sandbar you had walked across in the spring was gone, and the far bank had shifted, taking a crooked willow tree with it. At the time you had thought little of it. Rivers did that. But now, years later, you're older, and that slow restlessness makes more sense. You rise before the others. It's not yet light, though the sky is beginning to shift from black to the soft grey of approaching dawn. There's a coldness in the air, but not the kind that bites sharply. This is a damp chill, one that comes up through the soles of your feet and settles in your bones if you stand still too long. You pull your fur tighter and step out toward the edge of the camp. The path is familiar, soft grass flattened by many bare feet and a faint trail through tall reeds where the fishing lines are sometimes tied. It rained last night. The earth smells clean and unsettled. The river always smells strongest after rain. When you reach the bank, you stop. Something is different. The bend is wider now. A section of land has been dragged away, just enough to notice. A few trees lean at strange angles, their roots partially exposed. The narrow channel where children used to drop leaf boats has filled in with debris. It looks less like the river you remember, and more like a stranger passing through the place it used to belong. You crouch low, touching the damp ground with one hand. The water has left new prints in the sand, sharp-edged stones where soft earth once was. You don't say anything out loud. Talking to the river has never made it listen. But you do think for a moment about how it never stays. Not for you. Not for anyone. By the time you return to camp, the others are beginning to stir. A few voices, low and steady, drift out from the shelters. Someone is blowing softly on embers, trying to coax flame back into life. The morning smells like wet wood smoke and boiling roots. One of the younger men approaches you with a twisted expression. He lost his fishing net in the night. He says, tied it carefully, checked it twice, but it's gone. Probably pulled down river. You nod slowly. Of course it is. The river moves, that's what it does. You help him gather new materials. Strips of bark, long reeds, a few strong branches for the frame. You work side by side, hands moving without needing much thought. He's frustrated, you can tell. Not angry at the river, exactly, just tired of having to start over. As you weave, he tells you something one of the elders said, that there was a time when the river stayed still, back when the world was younger and the water knew its place. But then the river got bored, or angry, or hungry, it depends on who's telling the story, and began to shift, slowly at first, then faster. It never stopped. That's why the fish move, the trees fall, and the earth never quite remembers where to settle. You listen, but say nothing. You've heard that story before, in different forms. Some say the river is alive, others say it's cursed. A few say it's just water, but all agree you cannot make a home on the banks and expect it to last. By midday, you finish the net. It's not perfect, but it's strong. You knot it carefully and carry it down together to the water's edge. There's a new spot, a little further up, where the current seems calmer. You anchor it there and watch it settle, the reeds brushing softly against the mesh. The boy watches the river for a long time. Then he asks the question you knew was coming. Why don't we go somewhere safer? You take a breath, the kind that fills your chest but doesn't ease the weight inside it. Nowhere's safe, you say. Not for long. And that's the truth of it. Whether it's forest or mountain, sea or sky, everything moves. Everything changes. The only difference with rivers is that they show it. That night, after the sun sinks behind the ridgeline and the fire crackles low, someone shares food with the group. The fish were good today. The net held. But you all know it won't last. Tomorrow the river may flood again, or dry up, or pull the bank out from under you while you sleep. Still you stay, because there is no other choice. You don't live beside the river, because you trust it. You live beside it, because it's the only thing that never stops becoming something new. And in this time, between the hunt and the field, that's something like hope, or at least survival. In the silence before sleep, you think of the river again. And how, even if it forgets your footsteps by morning, you'll return to its edge all the same. A campfire in no one's land. The wind isn't strong, but it carries a new kind of cold, thin and dry, the kind that clings to the edges of your breath, and whispers that another season is near. You've walked further than usual today. Not for food, not for water, just distance. Sometimes that's reason enough. Your group is quiet, not tired exactly, just thoughtful. The land feels unfamiliar, even though it looks like all the others, low grass, distant tree lines, the occasional outcrop of lichen-covered stone. The sky has a wide, watching stillness to it, and every footstep feels louder than it should. You're not lost, not in the way we mean that now. There are no roads to miss, no destinations to misread, but there's a kind of drifting that happens out here. A long stretch between what you remember and what you recognize. A stretch where the land seems to belong to no one, not the herds, not the wind, not even you. When night comes, you build a fire. There's no shelter nearby, no old trail, no elder's tale of this place. But it's safe enough. The stones here are flat, dry, and there's wood, if you walk far enough into the trees. So you gather, stack, strike, wait. It takes a while, but eventually the flame catches, rising with a soft sputter into the night. You sit beside it, rubbing warmth into your palms, watching the shadows creep outward across the grass. A few others settle nearby, one sharpening a tool, another stripping fibers from a split reed, the rest simply staring into the flickering orange glow. This place, it doesn't feel like somewhere you should stay, but for tonight, it holds you. You pass a pouch of dried meat around the fire. It's tough, a little smoked, and chews more like bark than food. Still, it fills the belly. A few words are exchanged, quiet, short, not conversation, just acknowledgement. Here, together, still breathing, someone hums a bit of a tune, not a song, just a thread of sound woven into the fire's crackle. It rises and fades without beginning or end. You don't know when it started, you don't know when it stops. You look into the darkness and realize how little you can see. You don't fear it, you never have, but it still feels heavy. This is land without story. No one remembers hunting here. No one was born here. No one died here. As far as you know, it's empty, in a way few places are. The fire burns lower. You stir the coals with a long stick, watching sparks curl into the air and disappear. Someone asks, who lived here before? It's not really a question, more a wondering. a kind of reaching. No one answers, not because no one knows, but because there are too many answers. It could have been anyone, or no one. It could have been spirits, or people like you, long before your time. You think about footprints, buried and lost, of hearthstones now swallowed by moss, of tools dropped and left behind, of stories told beside another fire, in this same spot. So long ago the earth forgot their language. The past doesn't leave signs here. Just wait. Later in the night, you hear something beyond the fire, not close, not loud, just movement. You sit up slightly, not out of fear, just habit. Another in the group does the same. You glance at each other and listen. Nothing comes, only the wind again, and the hush of a land that doesn't want to speak. When you sleep, it's shallow, the kind of sleep that waits for dawn. Dreams come in pieces, a red deer running across a frozen stream, a face you haven't seen in years, mouthing words you don't understand, a campfire in a different place, with different people, and the same cold stars overhead. You wake before the others, ashes now, a soft breath of smoke in the air. The sky is pale, washed in the first light of morning. You step away from camp, just far enough to see the clearing, the place where the fire burned, where your people slept, where a little piece of time pressed itself into the dirt. And it occurs to you, by night you made this place yours. By day, the land will take it back. You won't mark it, you won't name it. You'll leave no sign but footprints. By the time the sun climbs, you'll be gone. And someone else, years from now, or centuries, might pass through and wonder the same thing. Who was here? Who stopped in this silence? And what did the fire see? The first hut and the last cave. You grew up in a cave, not deep and echoing but shallow, open to wind and firelight, the kind where smoke could rise through cracks above, and light could still find you in the morning. It wasn't a place you called home, it was simply where the fire lived, where the elders sat, where the rain softened before touching your skin. You didn't choose it. The cave was chosen by the land, the shape of the ridge, the angle of the cliff, the way water slid past the entrance instead of through it. These things made it safe, for a time. There were others before you. You knew that even as a child, scratched lines along the walls, half-buried stones that didn't come from this valley, the curve of an old fire pit too round to be natural. You never asked who made them. You didn't need to. They were people like you, hungry, cold, breathing through another hard winter. Caves were patient, they held silence well. They didn't move, didn't fade. They stayed even when you left them. The smoke-stained stone, the hollowed ash, the soot-dark handprints, these were your only history. But then something changed. It started slowly, like everything in your world does. A new shelter, nothing permanent. Just branches and mud, pressed together and leaning low. Someone in your group made it near the tree line, one spring. Not because they had to, just because the cave was full and the sky was full of rain. They built it, and it held. The wind pushed, the ground shifted, but the shelter stood. When the skies cleared, it didn't fall, so the next season more were built. You remember the way the air smelled in those shelters, damp wood, sun-warmed earth, the faint mold of old bark. They were strange at first, too bright in the morning, too dark at night, but they were dry, and dry was enough. You still returned to the cave sometimes, for ceremony, for memory, for reasons you couldn't explain, but less and less. The fires moved outside. The stories, too. You didn't call them huts. That word hadn't been born yet. But they were the first shapes of a future you couldn't imagine. One evening, you sat at the edge of the camp. 3 huts now, close together, angled toward the river. A child was sleeping beside the fire, a carved toy in their hand. You were weaving a net, quietly, when one of the elders came to sit beside you. She didn't speak at first, just watched the smoke drift. Then she said something that stayed with you. The cave, she murmured, always took us in. These we build ourselves. You nodded. She wasn't asking for an answer, just giving the thought a place to rest. You understood. The cave had been shelter. These were choices. These were decisions. And choices carried weight. The hut needed repair. It needed thought. It needed gathering and shaping and planning, in a way the cave never had. The cave waited for you. The hut depended on you. There was a boy who never knew the cave. He was born under bark and thatch, grew up with woven walls instead of stone. When the wind came, he didn't run for the cliffs. He He pressed mud into the cracks, laid heavier branches, tied fresh twine. To him, that was normal. He asked once why you spoke of the cave with such softness. You couldn't explain it. Not really. You just said, the cave remembered us. He laughed, not cruelly, just the way the young laugh at things they've never needed. The last time you visited the cave, it was quiet, cold, dusty with time. Someone had left a bundle of dried reeds near the back wall. You wondered if it had been meant as a mat or a gift. You didn't touch it. You walked slowly to the place where the fire had always burned. There were still bones in the ash, not human. Deer, maybe, or hair. The marks on the wall were fading, scratched by generations, weathered by years. A few dots, a curved figure, a hand, smeared with ochre, smaller than your own. You pressed your palm against the same stone. It didn't match. You were taller now, stronger, older, and further away from the person who once crouched in that dark with soot on their cheeks and stories only half understood. You stayed until the cold made your joints stiff. Then you stepped out, back into the sun, back to the hut where someone was calling your name. Not the kind spoken with mouths, but the kind known through gesture, memory, belonging. That night, you sat by the fire, not thinking of the past but of the roof above your head. It would need repairs before the next storm. The wall near the southern post sagged slightly. You'd fix it. You all would. The cave would stay as it was, watching, waiting, cradling the dark. But this you had made. You would sleep inside walls shaped by your own hands. And somewhere, far into the future, someone would call this moment history. But for now, it was just the night, and the fire, and the hut, and the long, slow breath of a world just beginning to settle. The bones we buried without gods. You don't believe in gods. Not because someone told you not to, and not because you lack imagination, but because the world doesn't need gods to feel full. The wind is real. The river is real. The hunger that settles behind your ribs each night, that too is real. And death is real. You've seen it up close. The stillness that comes after breath, the way the chest no longer rises, the way the warmth fades, not all at once, but slowly, like water slipping through cracked fingers. It's not frightening, not really, but it is final, or it used to be. Because even though you don't speak of gods, you've started to bury your dead, not leave them, not burn them, not let the animals take them. You place them in the ground, and you cover them. It didn't used to be that way. Once, death meant return. Bones left in the open, exposed to sky and wind, to be broken down and carried away like everything else. You believed that what left the body had no shape, no path, it just faded. But now, things are different. The first burial you remember was in the valley with the crooked tree. A child, no older than 6 winters, caught in a flood. The river pulled too fast. No one could reach her in time. The body was found downstream, curled against a fallen branch. The skin was pale and cold, the eyes half open, and no one could bring themselves to leave her. So they dug. It wasn't deep, just far enough to keep the animals away. Stones were placed over the mound. A handful of dry flowers were scattered, bright yellow and wilted, not for beauty, just because they were nearby. Someone added a small bone carving. It was her favorite. No one said what it meant, but no one argued, either. After that, burials became more common. You still don't believe in gods, but you believe in memory. When someone dies now, there are steps, unspoken, but followed. The body is washed. The eyes are closed. A cloth is laid across the chest, not for warmth, but for respect. If the person had something they carried often, a flint, a carved shell, a shaped piece of wood, it is placed beside them. Sometimes they are buried near the fire pit, sometimes beyond the tree line. The elders decide, or the wind does, or the way the crows move that day. No one says prayers, no one chants, but there is silence, and silence is a kind of reverence. You think about death more often now, not in fear, but in curiosity. Where does the breath go? You don't ask aloud. It would sound strange, but you wonder. You've felt it leave. You've held someone's hand as they faded. There is something that goes missing, something that isn't weight, or blood, or name. Sometimes you think it returns to the earth. Sometimes you think it walks, follows the trail you once knew, alone, without body, not looking for a place, just waiting to forget. There was a time, not long ago, when no one wondered. Now, you all do. That too is new. A woman dies in early autumn. She was older than anyone in the group. Her hair had gone the color of ash, her back curved like a branch too long in the wind. She hadn't spoken much in the last year, but when she did, her voice carried the sound of long memory. When she passed, the camp grew still. No one wept loudly, no one wailed, you wouldn't know how. But everything slowed, the fire burned lower, the tasks of the day were paused, even the dogs lay still. Her burial was careful, her mat was laid beneath her, her hands were folded, her beads, worn smooth by time and touch, were strung across her chest. She was placed beside a birch tree near the edge of the clearing, where the ground was soft and the birds gathered at dawn. You covered her gently, a little soil at a time. Afterward no one spoke. That night, the wind changed direction. You noticed, everyone did. No one said why. Some in your group have begun to carve marks on flat stones, simple ones, circles, lines, notches. They're not meant to be read, just remembered, placed at certain sites, left beside graves, marked near the old paths. You're not sure who started it, but the stones stay. Sometimes you pass them, and place your hand flat against the surface, not in belief, in recognition. There are stories, of course. The woman who turned into a deer, the man whose voice became thunder, the twins who climbed a tree so tall it pierced the sky. You don't believe them, not exactly, but you tell them anyway, because telling stories makes the silence feel shaped. You don't have gods, not yet, but something is forming, not above you, or outside you, but within the choices you keep making, to bury, to remember, to return to a place just because someone once died there. These are not habits, these are beginnings, beginnings of something you cannot name, but one day, someone will, and they will look back and say this was when belief began, not in heaven, not in judgment, but in the simple act of placing bones in the earth, and staying a moment longer than necessary. Stone, wood, and the memory of rain. You've been in this valley before, though you don't remember when. It could have been many seasons ago, or maybe it was someone else who walked here, a parent or a companion now gone. But something in the way the light falls across the stones feels familiar. The slope of the hill, the scent of crushed grass beneath your steps, the birds nesting low in the reeds. It all feels like memory, but not your own. You've stopped walking for the day. The sky has the color of distant water, and there's a pressure in the air that suggests rain by nightfall. The others are gathering firewood and unpacking what little was carried. A skin of water, a few small tools, strips of dried root. A child is helping someone clear a patch of earth to build the fire. Another sits nearby, carving absently into a smooth length of bark with a dull edge of flint. You walk away from the group, just a short distance, and follow a shallow line in the ground. It's not a path in the modern sense, no stones laid, no markers, but it's something. The ground is worn here, faintly, like the heel of a hand pressed into soft clay long ago. You follow it up the ridge and into a low rise of stone. There, between two broken boulders, you find what you didn't know you were looking for. A circle of rocks, covered now with lichen and leaf fall, half hidden under years of weather. You kneel beside them and run your hand over the surface of the largest one. It's smooth on one side, the way stone becomes when touched too many times. In the center of the circle, a small depression in the ground, like an old fire pit, long since filled with soil. You don't know who made this, or when, or why, but it's clear someone did, and they stayed long enough to leave this behind. You sit there a while, and listen to the breeze as it moves through the grass. There are no voices, no echoes of the past, but still, the place feels full, as if it's waiting. When you return to camp, the fire is burning low and steady. The smell of damp wood smoke drifts upward into the darkening sky. The air is thicker now. The first drops of rain are just beginning to fall. You and another begin shaping a quick shelter. Nothing elaborate, just a frame of long branches tied together with thin lengths of fiber and draped with hides that still carry the scent of river and smoke. You've done this many times, but tonight it feels slower, more careful. You anchor the posts with small stones and press your palm against each one when it's set, not as a test of strength, but as if to tell it, stay. By the time the rain begins in earnest, you're inside. You sit with your knees pulled close, the heat of the fire just outside the doorway, and watch the drops strike the surface of the hides above your head. The sound is soft, constant, almost musical. You feel it more than hear it, a rhythm in the earth. Someone speaks beside you. They say something about the stones on the ridge. You're not the only one who saw them, it turns out. They mention finding similar ones seasons ago, in another valley, far from here. No one ever stays long in those places, but people always return. There's something about them, about shaped stone in a wild place that calls back without words. Another voice says that stone remembers, that wood dies and skin rots and fire vanishes, but stone waits. It stays longer than people, longer than trees, longer than rain. You don't know where the idea came from, but everyone nods. It begins to rain harder. The hides above bend inward slightly with the weight. You check the supports, run your hand along the seams, press down the edges. The shelter holds. That night, as you drift towards sleep, the rain becomes the only sound. You can't see the stars, you can't hear the river, but you can feel the stone beneath the soil, and the wood holding above, and the fire just beyond the entrance, glowing orange in the mist. You fall asleep thinking about the people who built the circle of rocks. You don't know their names, but you've remembered what they made, and that for now is enough. What the wolves still knew about us. You don't see them often, not anymore. The wolves keep their distance. They're clever that way, but you know they're out there, always just beyond the tree line, or behind the next hill, or standing perfectly still in a thicket of snow-heavy brush, while you pass only a few paces away, unaware. Sometimes, at night, you hear them. Not the full howling that frightens children, not the long, echoing cries people speak of in stories, just the soft pads of paws on frost-bitten earth, or the low, quiet shuffle of movement in the dark, steady and unhurried. They don't come close to the fire anymore. They've learned, but long ago, things were different. There was a time, though no one remembers exactly when, that wolves walked closer to your kind, not tame, not friendly, but close, close enough to steal meat, close enough to sleep near the edge of camp when the nights were bitter and the wind refused to stop. There are stories of it, not myths, just memories, told by old ones, then forgotten, then told again, of one winter, perhaps 24 seasons ago, when the snow came early and stayed too long. Food was thin, the rivers froze, and the wolves, desperate but clever, began to follow your fires more boldly. One morning, someone woke to find a wolf lying not 10 paces from the camp, curled in a tight ball, its breath visible, its ribs sharp beneath thinning fur. No one approached, but no one drove it away, either. Later that same day, someone tossed a bone into the dark. They didn't mean anything by it. It was a gesture, not a gift. But the wolf took it, quietly, with no sound but the crunch of teeth on frozen marrow. From then on, they were never far. You think about that sometimes, when you're walking alone. There are tracks in the snow, fresh, clean, clear, not deer, not hare, not human. Wolf. You kneel beside them. They lead down into the valley, where the river bends. The same river your group has followed for weeks. The same bends, the same trees, the same sounds of ice breaking softly in the current. The wolves are still there. You're certain, not watching, not stalking, just knowing. There's a boy in your group who doesn't believe the stories. He says wolves are animals, nothing more. Hungry, dangerous, without thought. He says it in the way the young say many things, with certainty shaped more by inexperience than wisdom. One night, he finds a stone near camp, smooth, flat, marked with long scratches, curved and deliberate. He calls it a carving, says it looks like a wolf. Maybe it does, or maybe that's just what he wants to see. He keeps it, tied to his pack. Later, the elders say the markings are too regular to be accidental. They say someone long ago left it here on purpose, maybe as a warning, maybe as a memory. The boy shrugs. He doesn't understand what they're trying to say, but you do. There's something about the way wolves move that reminds you of people, older people, the kind who don't speak unless needed, who study without blinking, who know how to wait. Wolves wait better than anyone. They wait when you sleep, they wait when you hunt, they wait when your fires die low, and your guard drops, just for a moment, but not to strike, to see. You believe, though you've never said it out loud, that wolves remember you, not you, exactly, but your kind, your shape, your smell, the sound of your step, the rhythm of your breathing when you're not afraid. They knew you before your people learned to stay in one place, before huts, before burial, before the idea of owning the land beneath your feet. They knew you when your hands were still shaped for climbing, when your tools were teeth and instinct, when your fire was a fragile, stolen thing. And they still know you now, not because you are dangerous, but because you were once the same. Once long ago, when the stars were lower in the sky, and the trees grew farther apart, there were no lines between people and wolves, just the cold, just the hunt, just the firelight shared by two species that didn't yet know they would become enemies, or companions, or stories told by grandchildren near modern hearths. Wolves remember that time. They don't tell it in words, they don't pass it down, but they carry it, somewhere behind the eyes, in the way they circle firelight, never entering, never forgetting. You see them now and then, at the edge of memory, a blur of grey across a ridge, a pause in the forest's rhythm, a pair of eyes reflecting back your firelight, blinking once before vanishing into the trees, and in that moment, you understand, you were being watched, not with hunger, but with recognition. You were never their masters, you were never their prey, you were something else, something they still remember, even if your people no longer do. The ones who walked without borders, no one told you where to go. There were no roads to follow. No signs, no maps, no boundaries etched into the earth with names. You walked because the world had room, because the sky didn't end, because hunger moved before you like a whisper, and the seasons tugged your steps like rivers tug stones. You've never thought of yourself as lost, even when the land was unfamiliar. The word doesn't exist, not in your language. You don't lose the earth. You only wait until it becomes familiar again. The people you walk with, they come from different valleys, different rivers. Some remember the northern snows, where the trees grow thin and black, where the sun rises late and leaves early. Others speak of the southern coastlines, where the wind tastes of salt and bones wash up like driftwood. You've never seen those places, but you've seen their stories written in their hands, in the tools they carry, in the way they look at the sky to tell the time. No one owns the land beneath your feet. The idea of ownership is still centuries away. This ground does not belong to you, and you do not belong to it. You share it for a while, until the wind changes, until the herds move, until the soil grows thin and the roots taste bitter. You carry no flag, no title, no word for foreigner. There are only people who eat what you eat, and people who don't. Sometimes you pass another group, camped near the edge of the river, or moving slowly in the opposite direction, across a wide stretch of grassland. You don't always speak, but you always see each other. You can tell a great deal before a word is exchanged. The shape of their fire, the way their clothing fits, the tools slung over shoulders, the rhythm of their gait. Sometimes a gift is exchanged, a length of twine, a cooked root, a sharp flake of stone, sometimes not. But you never fight. Not yet, not often. There is still enough space in the world for silence to mean respect, not threat. There's a word in your tongue that doesn't translate easily now. It means something like friend not known yet. It's used when speaking of the people you meet on the road, the ones who pass you with tired eyes and never look back. The ones who share no blood, no fire, no stories, but still walk the same earth, under the same cold stars. You think about that often. That there was once a time when strangers weren't enemies, just mirrors. One evening, as the sun folds itself behind the mountains, you make camp in a hollow shaped by wind and centuries. The ground is dry and soft, the fire is easy to build. Someone is boiling something in a stone-lined pit. Another is humming softly while they strip bark from a young tree. A few children are playing with a loop of braided grass, tossing it between them with laughter too tired to rise above the wind. You sit apart, watching the ridge. There's movement, a figure. Then another, distant, silent. They don't approach, but they see you, and you see them. You raise a hand, palm open, just once. One of them mirrors it, that's all. Then they vanish behind the hill. You feel no fear, only a kind of quiet understanding that the earth is big, and all of you are just walking through it. Later that night, someone asks where you're headed next. You shrug. No one ever knows exactly. There are places your group likes to return to, a grove of fruiting trees near the southern ridge, a cave with a spring that tastes sweet even in dry months, a flat plain where the herds always pass by midsummer. But nothing is fixed. The world isn't built for borders. It changes faster than memory. Rivers shift, trees fall, mountains crumble. All you can do is move with it. There's an old woman in your group. Her voice is soft and cracked, like dry bark. She tells stories few understand fully, but everyone listens to her. She says she once walked so far east, the sun rose behind her and ahead of her all at once. No one knows what she means, but it sounds true. She speaks of a time when the stars told you which way to walk, when the wind spoke in the voices of animals, when the ground itself bent to meet your foot. She says there was a path once, wide as a river, worn into the land by so many generations walking the same line that even the trees grew differently along its edge. You ask if it still exists. She shakes her head. It's still there, she says, but no one knows they're walking it. You wonder sometimes what it will be like when people stop walking, when they stay, when they build things that don't move, when they claim land as something to defend instead of something to pass through. You don't think you'll see that day, but you feel its shadow. It's there in the way your shelters are starting to last longer, in the way fires are built in the same place, again and again, in the way paths are becoming trails, and trails are becoming tracks. Still, for now, you walk, because you were born into a world without fences, because the horizon is not a line, but an invitation, because the only law you know is the changing season, and the only home you carry is the one you build each night from whatever the land allows. You are one of the ones who walk without borders, and though your footprints will be washed away by time and rain, for this moment, you are free. When the seasons no longer waited, it wasn't always like this. The seasons used to follow each other like old travelers on a path. Winter would come, cold and patient, letting you prepare. Spring would wait at the edge of frost, never rushing, never surprising. Summer warmed slowly, stretched itself wide, then bowed out so autumn could slip in quietly, with its thin wind and falling light. But now, something's changed. You're not sure when it started. Maybe last year, maybe the year before that. Maybe it began so slowly, no one noticed until it was too late. The rains don't come when they should. The sky grows hot, then cold, then hot again, never pausing long enough for the roots to understand. Berries flower and die before insects find them. The herds move earlier now, or later, or not at all. The world no longer signals itself the way it once did. You wake one morning to frost on the grass and mosquitoes in the air. The trees are still green, but the ground feels like winter. Your hands ache from the cold, though it's only early autumn. A bird flutters overhead, lost and alone. Its call sounds uncertain, out of place. You look to the oldest among you, but even they seem unsure. The elders used to say that the earth speaks, that the wind carries warning, that if you listened, really listened, you'd always know what was coming. But now you listen, and there's only silence, or worse, confusion. You sit beside the fire that night, stirring a pot of roots and bitter herbs. The smoke curls strangely, downward, caught in a pocket of air that doesn't move. Someone says they dreamed of snow, another says they heard frogs the night before. Neither makes sense. Someone laughs, but it's a short sound, not joy, just a way to fill the space. You try to find meaning in the little things. The shape of a leaf's curl, the way birds migrate, or don't, the thickness of animal fur, the brightness of the moon, but the signs contradict each other. One tree says spring, another says death. One breeze carries warmth, the next a sharpness that bites the skin. You've built your life on waiting, waiting for rain, waiting for berries to ripen, waiting for snow to melt before the hunt. But now the seasons don't wait for you, and they don't wait for each other. There's a girl in your group who sings a song each morning. It's not a song you taught her, it came to her, she says, from a dream. The notes don't follow a rhythm, the melody wanders, but each morning she sings it softly, while gathering kindling or shaking dew from the sleeping mats. One day you ask her what the song means. She shrugs. It's a map, she says, for when things forget where they're going. You don't press further, but you begin to hum it too, under your breath. One afternoon, as the sun falls low and long, you walk to the edge of a clearing where old trees lean like tired bones. The ground beneath them is soft, thick with moss that smells like rain. You crouch and dig gently with your fingers. The soil is dry, too dry for this time of year. You hold a handful in your palm. It crumbles. You look up at the sky. It's pale, not blue, not grey, just faded, like a memory left too long in the sun. You remember a time when you could smell the next season. Now all you smell is dust. You return to camp. The fire is strong tonight. It has to be. The wind has turned sharp, and though it's still early in the moon cycle, frost has crept across the edges of the shelters. You sit close, knees drawn in, arms wrapped around your chest. Someone asks if this is how things will be now, if the seasons will always arrive wrong, or not at all. No one answers. But deep down you all feel the truth. The world has begun to forget its own rhythm, and without that rhythm, you are left unanchored. You think sometimes of the animals, how they know when to leave, how they know where to go. What happens when even they forget? What happens when the patterns unravel too far to follow? You don't say it out loud, but the thought sits with you heavy and unmoving. If the world no longer waits, then neither can you. You must learn to walk with no season, to plant without certainty, to hunt with fewer signs, to sleep under skies that tell no stories. And yet even now you find a kind of beauty, a mushroom growing where none should, a patch of green in the frost, a heron standing alone in a dry riverbed, waiting patient as stone. The world hasn't died, it's just changing, and you, like your ancestors, must change with it. You gather your tools, you tighten your shelter, you place one foot ahead of the other, and you walk, not because you know where the path leads, but because movement for now is the only season you still understand. The hunger between the herds, you never knew exactly when they would come. The herds didn't follow the kind of calendar you could count. Some seasons they arrived early, cresting over the distant hills in great waves of movement and breath and hooves. Other years they came late, smaller, thinner, quiet, and sometimes they didn't come at all. You knew they were everything. The herds meant food, tools, warmth. Their skins were your walls, their sinew was your cord, their bones became your needles, your handles, your weapons, your stories. Even their breath, the warm smell of their passing, felt like a kind of promise. As long as the herds came, your people would last another season. But between those visits, between one migration and the next, there was always a space, a long, empty stretch of days where the wind passed over empty plains and the sky stayed too quiet. It was during those stretches that hunger became its own presence, like a silent companion sitting just outside the firelight. You didn't starve, not right away. There were roots, there were birds, if you were quick. There were old caches hidden among tree roots, dried berries strung high above reach, but those stores never lasted. They weren't meant to. They were made for bad nights, not bad months. You learned in those days to stretch what little you had. A single bone could be boiled 3 times, sometimes 4, if you were careful and patient. You ground seeds into powder and mixed them with ash, just to thicken broth. You peeled bark and chewed it without swallowing, just to trick your body into stillness. The old ones said this was always how it had been. They remembered lean times, spoke of winters where people disappeared quietly, one by one, not from disease or cold, but simply because they grew too thin to carry firewood. But knowing this didn't make the hunger easier, it only made it familiar. There was a rhythm to those hunger days. In the morning you kept busy, walking farther for roots, digging deeper where the frost had begun to loosen its grip. You learned to spot small game tracks by the way the grass bent, not by footprints. You watched birds to see what they ate. If a raven picked at the ground long enough, you followed it. If it flew away empty, you didn't. By midday, the camp quieted. The fire burned low to conserve fuel. Even the children stopped asking when the food would come. The air felt heavy, though it was no warmer than before. You wrapped yourself in skins that still carried the scent of last season's hunt, pretending, sometimes, that the scent itself was enough. In the evening, you gathered close, not for heat, it was too early for true cold, but for comfort. Someone would tell a story, not a loud one, not the old legends of monsters and first fires, just memories, quiet tales about a good catch, a long walk that ended in luck, a year when the herd came early and thick and stayed for days. You didn't tell these stories to remember. You told them so the hunger wouldn't be the only thing in the room. One night, you dreamed of the herds, not as animals, but as sound, a distant thunder, growing closer, until it filled every breath. You woke with your heart racing, and for a moment, you were certain they'd come. But the morning was still, the ground was bare, only the wind moved. There were arguments, whispers, should we wait, or move? Some wanted to travel west, toward the low hills where the water still pooled. Others believed the herd would return here, like it always had. The decision wasn't yours to make, but you watched it unfold in glances, in long silences, in the way packs were slowly tightened and fires allowed to die out. In the end, you stayed. It was the waiting that made it hardest. You could survive on little. You knew how to chew dried hide until it softened, how to boil pine needles, how to trap a frog with nothing but string and stillness. But waiting, true waiting, wore down more than your strength. It wore down your belief, not belief in spirits or stories, but belief that the world would give again what it had taken. And then one morning, someone saw them, a dark line on the horizon, not cloud, not tree, moving. You climbed the ridge, eyes stinging from the wind, and watched as they approached, first in trickles, then in waves. The herd, thin from travel, slower than last year, but alive, they were back. The camp didn't cheer. There was no celebration, just movement, quick, quiet, coordinated. Spears checked, fires relit, voices lowered in the old way, the respectful way. You didn't speak of hunger when the herd was near, you didn't speak of need, you let the world give again, without question, as though it had never left you waiting. That night, when the smoke rose rich and sweet, and the bones cracked open with marrow still warm inside, no one said a word, because this was not a feast, this was survival resuming its breath, and already somewhere in your mind, you began counting the days until the herd would leave again, because in your world, even abundance had a shadow, and you had learned to live with it. Trading silence for seeds. You didn't come here for anything. Not really. This place, just a clearing beside a narrow stream, wasn't a destination. It was a pause. Your group had been walking for days, following the trails the animals left behind, hoping to reach the floodplains before the weather changed again. But when you saw the smoke in the distance, thin and drifting upward like a question, you stopped. There were others here. You didn't know them. You'd never seen their faces before, but they weren't strangers in the way you think of them now. Back then, a stranger was simply someone whose language hadn't yet entered your mouth. Not dangerous, not familiar, just new. You watched from the edge of the trees as they moved, slower than your group, more rooted. They had small shelters, not scattered like yours, but arranged in a half circle facing the water. Their tools looked different, fewer spears, more baskets. A wide flat stone lay in the center of their camp, worn smooth from use, and there was a sound, soft, rhythmic, steady, grinding. It took a moment before you realized what they were doing. Seeds, they were grinding seeds. You hadn't thought of them as food before, not really. Seeds were for animals, for birds. You'd chewed a few in hunger, maybe, but these people weren't desperate. They weren't gnawing at bark or boiling bones until they cracked. They were patient, focused. There was no panic in the way they moved. They had something you didn't. Not more, just different. You didn't speak to them that first day, but you stayed nearby, sleeping a short distance from their camp, your fire low and your voices lower, watching, listening. The second day, one of them approached. A woman, older than you, barefooted, hair bound in a knot that looked like twisted reeds. She didn't smile, but she didn't frown either. She offered a handful of something in her palm, small, flat, pale brown seeds, with a faint, nutty smell. You didn't reach for them, not because of fear, but because in that world, silence was part of the exchange. You offered a piece of dried meat instead, tough, salted with ash, from the last good hunt 2 weeks back. She took it, nodded once, placed the seeds beside your fire, and then she walked away. That was it. That was the first trade. No bargaining, no terms, just recognition. I have something. You have something. Let's not speak about the difference. Later that evening, you roasted the seeds in a shallow pan of bark. The scent was unexpected, rich, earthy, sharp. You ground a few against stone, added water, boiled them into a paste. It wasn't meat, but it was food, and it was new. That night, you thought about the trade. You didn't think of it as a transaction. It wasn't about value, it was about curiosity, about the pause that comes when someone shows you a way to survive that you hadn't considered. You slept uneasily, not because of danger, but because your thoughts wouldn't stop turning. What else don't I know? What else do they do differently? What do they see in me that I don't? In the morning you brought something of your own, a sharp flake of obsidian, edge still fresh, wrapped in dried grass. You left it near the edge of their camp without a word. You didn't wait to see who took it. You just walked away. By the fourth day, you noticed changes. One of your people now carried a basket, clumsily woven, uneven, but useful. Another had collected a few of the same seeds, and stored them in a hollowed gourd. The children tried copying the grinding motion with smooth stones, making more of a mess than anything useful, but laughing all the same. The others, those who had given you the seeds, watched. They didn't seem afraid. They didn't seem amused either, just calm. They had seen others come and go. You were not the first to pass through their clearing, but maybe you were the first to stay this long. You didn't stay forever. You never meant to. The rains would come, and your group would move again, following instinct and weather, and the weight of tradition. But before you left, you gave something more. Not a tool, not a gift. You showed them how you build your fires in the wind, low and wide, protected by curved stones. You showed them how you cook on coals, not flames, to keep the heat steady. They watched, then tried, and you could tell they would remember. That was enough. As you left the clearing, you glanced back once. The woman was watching you. She raised a hand, not in farewell, not in greeting, just to show you she saw. You nodded. The seeds stayed in your pack. You didn't know yet what they would become. You didn't know they would change everything. You just knew that something quiet had happened. A silence traded for a future you couldn't name. And that in your world was how change always began. When we watched the sky instead of the ground, it started slowly. You weren't looking for meaning, just signs. Clues, something to help you predict when the rains would come, or when the herd might return. You'd always watched the land for that, the texture of the soil, the way the leaves curled, the direction the wind bent the grass. But then someone noticed the moon. They didn't say anything grand about it, just that it seemed to rise a little later, each night. A little farther to the side, a little dimmer or brighter, depending on the time. They pointed it out one evening while the fire was low, their voice almost lost in the crackle. You looked up too, and for the first time, realized how much was happening above you. The sky wasn't just something that held the stars. It moved. It changed. And it changed with you. You didn't know their names. The stars, you didn't even know they had names. But they had positions, and those positions shifted. One night a star might be just above the eastern trees. A few days later, it would be gone, or higher, or replaced by another. You began to mark them. Not on stone, not at first, just in your mind. This one comes when the berries ripen. That one disappears when the nights grow long. You gave them your own names. Names no one would recognize now. Names shaped by wind and fire, and whatever animal you were hunting that season. One of the older people in your group, someone who rarely spoke, began arranging sticks in the dirt, copying the pattern of the sky each night. Not exact, but close. The rest of you watched, quietly. Some thought it was strange. Others found comfort in it. You had spent your whole life staring at the ground, and now for the first time, you were looking up. It changed the way you waited. Before you listened for the animals, for the wind, for the crack of branches under weight. But now you also listened to the dark above. You studied the way the moon thinned and widened. You tracked the faint colors at the edge of the horizon. Some nights, the stars would seem brighter than the fire. They had color too, though no one had noticed before. One was bluish. Another flickered like a dying coal. They pulsed ever so slightly, like breath. You began to wonder if the sky was breathing, and if it was, whether it noticed you. When you walked, you began to use the sky to guide you, not in the way birds did, not with perfect instinct, but with recognition. That star points toward the big river. That one disappears behind the hills you camped near last season. It wasn't science. Not yet, but it was attention, and attention in your world was everything. There was a story someone told, not old, not passed down, just a thought shared late at night, that once long ago, the stars were people, not ancestors, not spirits, just people who walked so far they never came back, people who went up instead of forward, and now they look down to make sure the rest of you don't get lost. You didn't believe it, but you didn't not believe it, either. You looked up and thought, maybe they were right. Maybe the stars were walking too, just slower than you could understand. There came a time when someone marked the sky with stones. Small ones, set in a circle, with lines pointing outward, not toward trees or rivers, but toward where certain stars rose. You didn't know what it meant, not fully, but you knew that someone had tried to make the sky stay still, to hold it in place, to catch it, just for a moment. The way you might hold a breath before the hunt. It was the first calendar, though you didn't have that word, just a memory in stone. One night, while lying beside the fire, you saw something strange, a star that moved, not slowly, fast. It cut across the sky like a burning branch thrown into the wind. Everyone saw it, and no one spoke, because you didn't have words for it yet. You only knew that the sky could surprise you, and anything that could surprise you was worth fearing, or honoring, or both. After that, you watched more closely. You counted days by moonlight. You named nights by stars. You began to sense that the world was not just a place you walked on, but something you were inside of, something bigger, older moving with you, but not for you. The sky became a kind of map, not to where you were going, but to who you were becoming. And even now when you walk the same paths your ancestors once did, you still look up, not for answers, but for continuity. Because once long ago you were the kind of person who watched the sky and trusted it more than the ground beneath your feet. The fire that didn't move, it had always gone with you. The fire was never meant to stay in one place. You carried it, guarded it, sheltered it, like a living thing. A coal tucked in ash, a glowing bundle of moss inside a shell of bark, slung over a shoulder as carefully as a newborn. Wherever your group walked, the fire went too, and when it died, suddenly by rain or wind, you felt the silence like hunger. You didn't think of it as an invention. It was a companion, a necessity, something the world sometimes allowed you to have, and other times refused without warning, until the day it stayed. You hadn't meant to settle here. The clearing was nothing special. A bit of high ground beside a crooked stream, tree cover sparse, game trails thin. You stopped because someone in your group had a wound that wouldn't heal, and you needed time, just a few days. Long enough to rest, to make poultices, to find softer food and boil it slowly, so you lit a fire. A proper one, not the traveling kind. You ringed it with stone, built it deep, used the heavy wood that takes longer to catch, but burns for days. It was the kind of fire you only made when you had time, and then you didn't leave. One day passed, then another, then 5, then 10. The wound healed slowly. Others began shaping tools from the local stone, which turned out to be better than what you'd carried. The stream held fish. The trees had bark, good for binding. Children began recognizing the shape of the land. Still the fire burned. You've built many fires before, but this one felt different. It didn't just warm or cook or protect, it began to mark time. Ash piled up, charcoal spread into the soil, stones blackened and cracked. When you looked at it, you could see how many days had passed, how many nights you had waited. You could see permanence, not in the way you think of it now, but in the way a scar is permanent. And then someone built a second fire, smaller, for cooking, separate from the main one. Then another, for drying skins. You weren't just keeping the fire alive anymore, it was keeping you. It was subtle. At first, the shift, a pile of stones was placed to mark a favorite sitting place. Bark was peeled from only one tree, over and over, because it was close, and straight, and strong. A few people began sleeping in the same place each night. A pattern formed in the grass, and then came the shelter. Not a lean-to, not a traveler's shade, but a real structure, upright, deliberate, with walls packed in clay and grass, with a roof designed to last through rain. You helped build it without speaking about what it meant. You didn't ask, "Are we staying?" You just stayed. The fire became more than warmth. It was memory. It held the stories of your waiting. The meat you shared when the fever broke, the laughter when the child caught their first fish, the quiet grief when the elder who taught you to shape stone finally stopped breathing and was placed beneath the soft dirt by the roots of a tree, now always called hers. The fire didn't move, and neither did you. Not for weeks, not for seasons. You still hunted, still walked, but now you returned. That was new. Returning wasn't something you'd done before. Before, every return had been a coincidence. Finding the same grove, the same river bend, the same cliff edge by accident or by need. Now it was choice, and the fire never went out. You noticed animals began behaving differently. They no longer fled at your scent. They lingered near the edges. Birds nested low. Squirrels watched you build. Even the wolves, long gone and long feared, began to circle in patterns, curious but cautious. They sensed it too, that you were not just passing through, that you had changed. The land began to change with you. Paths formed where your feet always fell, grass thinned where your children ran. Bark grew thicker where it was cut and left. Even the smell of the place shifted. Wood smoke, ash, sweat, fish, fire, a smell that meant people lived here. And then one morning, as you stirred the coals from the night before, you realized you no longer remembered what it felt like to carry fire. You'd stopped needing to. The fire stayed, and so did you. You weren't yet a farmer, not yet a builder of walls or keeper of grain, but you had made a decision without meaning to stop running, to start watching, to mark your days with smoke that rose from the same place each morning. The fire had become a point in the world, and you had become a person who returned. A village without a name. No one decided to build it. There was no meeting, no moment when someone stood up and said, "This will be our village." That word didn't even exist yet. What you had was something simpler, a fire that stayed burning, and people who began returning to it instead of walking away. At first it was just a few shelters, one by the stream, one near the trees, one built close to the cooking stones for warmth. Each was made with what was available: branches, bark, packed earth. Nothing grand, nothing meant to last. But they did, and each season when your group returned to the clearing, the old shelters were still there, not untouched, weathered, partly collapsed, scattered with leaves, but recognizable, familiar, like bones of something not quite gone. So you repaired them, strengthened the roofs, rebuilt the walls, added new shelters nearby for those who had joined since the last migration. The place began to take shape, not because of a plan, but because of repetition. One day someone said, "We always sleep here," and just like that, here became more than just ground. It became a place. There was no word for it yet. Not town, not home, not anything that would make sense now, but you felt it in your body, even if you didn't speak it aloud. When you came over the ridge and saw the old stone circle, or the trail where the grass had stopped growing, something shifted in your chest. Recognition, not memory, deeper than that. Something quieter. You knew this place. You had shaped it, and it had shaped you. Soon things began to stay that never stayed before. A weaving frame, left leaning against a tree, a grindstone too heavy to carry, set permanently in the ground, a wooden bowl, cracked but still useful, always left near the main fire pit. Children began to play in the same corners. People sat in the same spots, without meaning to. You began to know the place, by sound, the way the stream rustled at night, the creak of wind through the 3 bent trees near the southern edge, the low echo of footsteps across the hard-packed dirt where meals were shared. None of it was marked, but all of it mattered. You noticed that your dreams changed here. Out on the trail, you dreamed of animals, danger, sky. Here your dreams were about people, familiar faces, conversations that never quite happened, days that might come again. This place held stories now, not the kind you told around the fire, but the kind you lived without realizing. Like the time someone fell and broke a bone, and everyone worked together to mend it. Like the first day someone said, "You stay, I'll go hunt." Like the morning a child was born, and no one left camp for 3 days. Moments that rooted themselves into the dirt, moments that did not travel with you, moments that belonged here. One evening, a stranger arrived, not a threat, just someone passing through. Their skin was marked differently, their tools had a shape you didn't recognize. They asked, "What is this place called?" And you didn't know what to say, because you had never needed to name it. It wasn't a thing, it was a part of you. You answered with a shrug, then pointed to the fire, to the shelters, to the stream. The stranger nodded, understanding enough. The next season they returned, and they stayed. You still walked sometimes, still hunted, still followed the old trails, but more and more you returned here. Others did too. The group grew, not all at once, slowly, like moss. You built things heavier, thicker. You made paths between shelters, so your feet wouldn't drag through mud. You buried your dead at the edge of the trees, and for the first time they did not vanish into wilderness. They stayed. Their names were remembered, their stories repeated, and so were yours. You never gave it a name, because it didn't need one. A name is something you give to mark a boundary, to say, this is this, and that is not. But this place wasn't about boundaries, it was about return. You didn't own it, you didn't claim it, you just lived within it, and that was enough. What the elders whispered, then forgot. You didn't write things down, not yet, not because you didn't want to remember, but because you remembered differently. Memory was shared, passed like a tool, hand to hand, a story told not to be recorded, but to be repeated, and the ones who carried the most of it were the elders, not the strongest, not the loudest, but the ones who had walked the farthest and returned, the ones who had seen things twice and noticed the difference. They sat close to the fire in the evenings, their backs rounded, their voices soft. Their words weren't commands, they were textures, a certain way of describing the river in winter, a warning about mushrooms that looked like the safe kind, but weren't, a name for the wind when it shifted too fast and made the animals disappear. You didn't question them, you just listened, and in time, you started to remember what they remembered, or most of it, because not everything stayed. One day an elder forgot a name. It was small, a tree name, nothing essential. They paused in the middle of a story, brow furrowed, trying to remember the word for the tall tree, with the bark that peeled in long strips. They waved their hand in the air, frustrated. Someone offered a guess. The elder nodded, but slowly, not quite sure. You didn't think much of it. A few nights later, they told a story, but the ending was different than the last time. You noticed, so did a few others. No one said anything. But later, as you sat near the cooking fire, you asked someone quietly which version was true. They shrugged. Maybe both. It wasn't that the stories were lost all at once. They softened, edges blurred, names shortened, places forgotten, replaced with gestures. The valley near the cold rock instead of the proper name. It was still enough to understand, still enough to follow, but you began to wonder what else had changed without you noticing. You didn't remember the original version of the story about the hill that made people sleep. You just knew it had always been told in late winter, when nights were long and the air thin. Someone asked once, "Why do we tell that story?" And no one had an answer. You just did, because the elders had, and now the elders didn't. The oldest among you, his name meant stone that floats, though no one remembered why, began repeating things. The same story, told twice in one night. The same advice, offered even when it no longer fit the season. You weren't annoyed. You were quiet, because something in you knew this was how forgetting started, not with silence, but with repetition. The mind trying to hold something that had already begun to slip. One morning, you asked an elder how far their people had ever traveled. They looked out over the ridge and said, "Farther than the bones." You asked what that meant. They didn't answer. They only smiled. You wanted to ask again, but something about their smile stopped you. Maybe they didn't know anymore. Or maybe they knew but not in a way that could be said aloud. Later that week, a younger one told the same story, with a new ending. Not on purpose, just because they had never heard the original. You realized then that the shift had already happened. The memory had already moved. It was different now, and it would keep changing. You began to understand that memory wasn't permanent. Not in this world. Not without words on bark or stone. Everything the elders told you lived in breath and air and time. And everything in breath and air and time eventually faded. Not with a storm, not with a scream, but with a pause, a blank space, a shrug, a changed detail. No one questioned. Still, you listened, because that's how memory worked. Not by being exact, but by being carried. And the weight of what was carried became your culture, even if you couldn't always explain it. Even if you forgot why it mattered. You remembered enough to pass it forward, and hoped that would be enough. The day the wild stopped coming back. You used to believe it would always return. The wild, that is. The deer that passed through the northern trees in early autumn. The ducks that skimmed low over the marsh when the frost came. The rustling of roots beneath your feet. The berries that burst in your fingers. The thin, sharp scent of new growth after the thaw. Even in hard seasons, even when things thinned, the wild never truly vanished. It just moved. It waited. And if you followed closely enough, if you listened well, it would show itself again. But this time, it didn't. At first, you thought it was your fault. You hadn't watched the right signs. You'd walked too far from the ridge, left offerings too late. You retraced your steps and tried again, then again. Still nothing. The old trails were silent. The traps you set remained untouched. The sounds at night were too still, as though something had been forgotten by the forest itself. You tried not to speak of it, not directly. No one ever said, "They're gone." They just asked each other quietly, "Did you see anything today?" And the answer kept being no. Days passed, then weeks. The fire still burned. The stream still ran. But the wild was missing. Not just the animals, but everything that moved of its own will. Birds, insects, even the way the grass used to shiver when nothing touched it. It was as if the world had taken a deep breath and held it. You walked farther, risked more. You climbed ridges you hadn't climbed in seasons, traced old herding routes, called out in the high voice your elders had once used to summon dogs or warn bears. No response. One morning, you found tracks barely there, just the suggestion of hooves near a dry patch of earth. You followed them, until they vanished into rock. The silence that followed felt heavier than hunger. The elders said it had happened before, once, a long time ago. They didn't remember the details, just a stretch of years where the land grew still, and no one knew why. It came back, they said, eventually. But the way they looked at the treetops said they weren't sure. You began to wonder if the wild had changed its path, if it had found other people, better ones, quieter ones. You stopped believing it would return on its own. So you began to adapt. You dug deeper for roots, ground bark into powder, chewed the soft tips of cattails for a little sweetness. You used stones you'd never shaped before, because they were the only ones close. You stretched every scrap of meat you had. You tried to raise fish in the shallows by blocking off part of the stream. It worked, barely, enough to keep the children fed, enough to keep the fire lit, but not enough to feel full. The stories around the fire shifted. Fewer hunts, more weather, fewer spirits, more questions. You noticed people stopped looking outward. They began looking down, at the ground, at their hands, at what was left. You saw a kind of grief growing, not loud, not sharp, but quiet. Rooted, because the wild had always been more than food. It was rhythm. It was certainty. It was the idea that you were part of something larger, older, untamed. Without it, you weren't sure what you were part of. You marked the days by what didn't return. The bird calls that had always come before rain. The scratch of mice beneath the straw mats. The shine of fox eyes at the edge of firelight, gone. The wild, it turned out, was not a place. It was a relationship, and something had broken it. You didn't know how. You didn't know when. You only knew that the forest was quieter now, and your people had started planting seeds where the paths once ran. Dreams of fruit in the dead of winter. It didn't even feel like hunger anymore. Not the sharp, stomach-hollow kind that comes when you've gone too long without food. That passed days ago. What you felt now was something slower, quieter, a kind of cold that came from the inside out. Not the cold of air, but of absence. And in that emptiness you dreamed, not of meat, not of broth, but of fruit, thick-skinned and soft-fleshed, heavy in the hand, sweet in a way that made your jaw ache. In your dreams, you bit into it, and it overflowed, juice trailing down your chin, the scent rising, the color so bright it hurt your eyes. You'd had it once, seasons ago, a cluster of them, deep in the South Valley, round, golden, growing wild in a place where the sun stayed longer. You ate so many you felt dizzy, then lay in the grass with the taste still on your tongue. Now, in the frozen stillness of midwinter, you craved it like breath. No one spoke of fruit this time of year. It was too far, too impossible. Winter was for storing, not desiring, for bark tea and frozen roots, for dried meat, for water warmed over embers. Winter was about patience, but you noticed it anyway. The craving, not just yours. One of the older children asked, half laughing, if anyone remembered the berries with the soft black seeds. Someone else stirred the fire, and said nothing. Another mentioned the red fruit that grew near the cracked rock ledge, so sour it made your whole mouth sting. The stories weren't shared to plan, they were shared to remember, and underneath the remembering was a quiet need. You found yourself watching the stores more closely, running your hand over the jars of dried mash, re-weighing the strips of meat, listening for the hollow sound when you knocked on the gourds. You knew how long things would last. You'd done the math, but knowledge didn't quiet the want. You started chewing pine needles, not for nutrition, just for the ghost of flavor. You mixed snow with ash, and let it melt in your mouth to chase off the feeling. It worked, for a while. Then the dreams came again. Always fruit, always bright, always warm. One night, an elder told a story you hadn't heard before. A village that lived inside the earth, so deep that the seasons passed above them like the wind through trees. In that village, fruit never spoiled. You could reach for it even in the coldest months, and it would still taste like sunlight. They didn't hunt, they didn't store, they just remembered where it grew. You asked, where is that village? They shrugged, nowhere. Or maybe it had been real once, but only in the kind of way that doesn't stay. Later that night, you looked out across the snow-covered ground, still, empty, pale under the moonlight. You knew what was under it, the pits, the seeds, the bones, the scattered remains of what had once been green. You told yourself it would return, the sun would come back, the roots would thaw, you would taste sweetness again. But in that moment, all you wanted was to remember it more clearly, to hold it in your hands, to stop it from being just a dream. And that, maybe, was how it began. Not agriculture, not preservation, but longing, not for survival, but for certainty, not for enough, but for more. You hadn't planted anything yet, but you had begun wanting the world to stay with you, to remain even when the sun didn't. You weren't just enduring winter, you were dreaming past it. The soft weight of waiting. It didn't even feel like hunger anymore. Not the sharp, stomach-hollow kind that comes when you've gone too long without food. That passed days ago. What you felt now was something slower, quieter, a kind of cold that came from the inside out. Not the cold of air, but of absence. And in that emptiness, you dreamed, not of meat, not of broth, but of fruit, thick-skinned and soft-fleshed, heavy in the hand, sweet in a way that made your jaw ache. In your dreams you bit into it, and it overflowed, juice trailing down your chin, the scent rising, the color so bright it hurt your eyes. You'd had it once, seasons ago, a cluster of them, deep in the South Valley, round, golden, growing wild in a place where the sun stayed longer. You ate so many you felt dizzy, then lay in the grass with the taste still on your tongue. Now, in the frozen stillness of midwinter, you craved it like breath. No one spoke of fruit this time of year. It was too far, too impossible. Winter was for storing, not desiring, for bark tea and frozen roots, for dried meat, for water warmed over embers. Winter was about patience, but you noticed it anyway. The craving, not just yours. One of the older children asked, half laughing, if anyone remembered the berries with the soft black seeds. Someone else stirred the fire and said nothing. Another mentioned the red fruit that grew near the cracked rock ledge, so sour it made your whole mouth sting. The stories weren't shared to plan, they were shared to remember, and underneath the remembering was a quiet need. You found yourself watching the stores more closely, running your hand over the jars of dried mash, re-weighing the strips of meat, listening for the hollow sound when you knocked on the gourds. You knew how long things would last. You'd done the math. But knowledge didn't quiet the want. You started chewing pine needles, not for nutrition, just for the ghost of flavor. You mixed snow with ash, and let it melt in your mouth to chase off the feeling. It worked, for a while, then the dreams came again. Always fruit, always bright, always warm. One night, an elder told a story you hadn't heard before. A village that lived inside the earth, so deep that the seasons passed above them, like the wind through trees. In that village, fruit never spoiled. You could reach for it even in the coldest months, and it would still taste like sunlight. They didn't hunt, they didn't store, they just remembered where it grew. You asked, "Where is that village?" They shrugged, "Nowhere." Or maybe it had been real once, but only in the kind of way that doesn't stay. Later that night, you looked out across the snow-covered ground, still, empty, pale under the moonlight. You knew what was under it. The pits, the seeds, the bones, the scattered remains of what had once been green. You told yourself it would return. The sun would come back. The roots would thaw. You would taste sweetness again. But in that moment, all you wanted was to remember it more clearly, to hold it in your hands, to stop it from being just a dream. And that, maybe, was how it began. Not agriculture, not preservation, but longing, not for survival, but for certainty, not for enough, but for more. You hadn't planted anything yet, but you had begun wanting the world to stay with you, to remain, even when the sun didn't. You weren't just enduring winter, you were dreaming past it. When bread meant surrender, you didn't plan to stay forever. The seeds had been planted half out of hope and half out of boredom, pushed into soft dirt at the edge of camp, near where the children played and the refuse was thrown. Someone noticed the sprouts, and instead of walking past them, you watered them, not every day. Just enough. It felt more like curiosity than commitment. But by the time the first stalks had grown, pale gold, thin, trembling in the wind, you realized you were still there, still waiting, still watching the grain grow. You told yourself it was temporary, just a season, just until the next herd came through, or the weather broke, or the old tracks opened again. But in your hands you held the seeds, you crushed them between stones, you added water, you shaped the paste with your fingers and cooked it on flat rocks warmed in the fire. It wasn't meat, it wasn't berries, it didn't burst in your mouth or bleed into your teeth. It was dry, dense, a little bitter, but it filled you, and it stayed. That night, someone asked for more, and you gave it. The thing about bread is that it doesn't chase you, it doesn't move, it doesn't scatter when you step too loudly, it doesn't hide in trees or sleep in burrows. It waits, quietly, predictably, and so you began to wait with it. Hunting had always been your rhythm, blood and breath, silence and sudden motion. Now the rhythm was different, slower, gentler, but deeper. Days marked not by kill or catch, but by weather, water, and patience. You didn't talk about what it meant, not yet, but somewhere in you, a shift began. The first time you chose bread over the hunt, it was raining, the trails were slick, the air was heavy, the animals were scarce. You looked at the wet woods, then at the wrapped bundle of baked mash by the fire, still warm from the morning's coals, and you stayed. You told yourself it was just that day, just the weather, but the next time was easier, and the time after that felt natural. Soon there were children in your group who knew how to grind grain before they knew how to notch an arrow. That was when you realized something had changed. Some argued it wasn't real food. Where's the hunt in it? One said. It doesn't test you, said another, and they were right. Bread didn't test you, it tamed you, it asked nothing but time, it rewarded patience. It didn't make you feel strong, it made you feel steady, and for the first time, that felt like enough. The elders watched it happen, slowly. They didn't stop it, but they remembered something you didn't. The sound of hooves returning, the fire-bright eyes in the forest, the song of hunger that sharpened the senses. They remembered a world where food moved, and they knew, even if they couldn't say it aloud, that when you chose bread, you weren't just feeding yourself differently, you were surrendering to stillness. You planted more the next season, not as an experiment, but as a plan. You marked the soil with sticks, you cleared weeds, you guarded the sprouts from birds. You began to speak of seasons instead of migrations, and though no one said the word surrender, you all knew. You had stopped asking the world to feed you, you had begun feeding yourself, and in doing so, you had laid down something you didn't realize you were carrying. Freedom. You hadn't lost it, you had traded it, for certainty, for safety, for something that didn't run when you approached, something that waited, something you had to kneel for. How the ground first held us hostage. It began as a choice. You told yourself that, again and again, you chose the valley because the soil was soft, because the water ran clean through the stones, because the sun lingered longer here than in the shadowed woods to the north. You chose the place for what it offered, but the place made its own demands. You didn't notice it at first, not when you cleared a few more shrubs, not when you stayed an extra season to protect the sprouts from frost, not even when you dug the earth deeper to store grain underground where the cold couldn't reach it. It felt like progress, like belonging, until one day someone asked, "When do we move again?" And no one had an answer, because you hadn't moved in years. It was subtle, the way the land claimed you. You stopped following the animals, you stopped reading the wind, the old trails faded, the bones of ancient fires disappeared beneath layers of turned soil and ash. You knew what the seasons would do before they did it, not because you watched the wild, but because you had shaped the land to behave the way you needed it to. You began to forget how to be surprised. The world no longer startled you. It waited for you, and in doing so, it made you forget how to leave. The ground was no longer just ground. It was storage. It was memory. It was work. You built things you could not carry. You dug holes you could not refill. You planted seeds you had to see through to harvest. And when the floods came, or the fire, or the cold too early or too late, you didn't flee. You stayed. You had to. A new kind of fear crept in. Not fear of the wild, but fear of losing what you had made. You no longer feared hunger alone. You feared the failure of the seed, the rot of the root, the silence of a harvest that never came. The land gave, but only if you gave more, and more, and more. You told yourself you owned it, but sometimes when you looked at your hands cracked from the soil, rough from grinding, red from carrying water, you wondered who belonged to whom. Children born now knew only this. They didn't know what it was to sleep under shifting stars, to run until your feet bled, to wake with the sound of animals passing close enough to smell. They knew the walls of the grain hut. They knew the names of trees by how useful their bark was. They knew the river not by where it led, but by how much it gave. One of them asked you, "What's beyond the ridge?" And you didn't remember. Not clearly, because the land had changed your memory. It had traded motion for certainty. It had wrapped its need around your own. You still told stories of before, of the days when the world was wide, when you could leave without planning, when no one stayed anywhere long enough to call it loss. But those stories felt older now, less like memory, more like myth. Because the earth held your labor in place, it held your tools, your dead, your children, and eventually, it held you. You had not meant to surrender. You had only meant to rest, to grow, to feed your people. But the ground had needs too, and once you gave yourself to it, it never let you go. The field that broke the hunter's spirit. He still wore the old tools, knapped stone knife at the hip, worn leather sling tied loose around the shoulder. The spear was newer, patched with careful bindings, shaped with younger hands, but the posture was the same, alert, balanced, ready. He didn't walk like the others anymore. Their feet had softened, accustomed to fields and flat ground. He still moved like a shadow through the underbrush. Even if the underbrush had been cleared seasons ago, they called him the hunter. Even though he hadn't brought down real game in months, he had returned to the village, only because the land had gone strange. Not dangerous, just tame. Game no longer passed in familiar cycles. The paths were overgrown. The sky was too quiet. He told himself it was temporary, that the animals would return. But when he came back, the people were building more huts, wider, lower to the ground, meant to last. They were planting again more than before. Whole plots, carefully marked, ringed with sticks. There were children scattering seeds with laughter. Their laughter made him ache. He'd seen laughter on a hunt before, the wild kind, born from risk, from the closeness of death and the joy of return. This was different. This was safe. They gave him a corner near the fire, a meal of flatbread and boiled root. No one asked what he'd found out there. No one asked where the herds had gone. They had stopped needing to ask, and he hadn't yet found a way to speak the truth. The wild wasn't avoiding them. It was gone. He went back out the next morning, not far, just to the edge of the cultivated field. It was wide now, larger than he remembered, furrowed deep, soft with fresh soil. He walked its perimeter slowly, boots dusted with the work of people who had never held a bow. At the far edge, he saw the new fence, built from green wood, still damp. A barrier not against predators, but against wanderers. He knelt beside the row of young shoots, grains, maybe barley. He didn't know the names, and he felt the anger rise. Not loud, not wild, just quiet. The kind that settles in your bones. He remembered when the forest used to stand here. He remembered how deer would pause at the tree line, ears flicking, bodies tense. He remembered the moment of stillness before a throw, the wind against his cheek, the breath held in his throat. Now, all of that was gone, replaced by rose, and quiet, and a life that asked no questions. He stood, looked back at the village, and realized he didn't belong in it anymore. That night, they invited him to sit at the center of the fire ring. Out of respect, they said, out of gratitude for all he had once brought. They gave him the choicest cut of boiled tuber. They passed him a carved drinking bowl, smooth from seasons of use. He held it. He ate. He nodded at their stories, and when they laughed, he tried to laugh too, but all he could think of was the field, and how it had taken something from him he hadn't known, could be lost. Not pride, not strength, but purpose, a way of being, a rhythm, a relationship, gone, not by force, but by progress. The next morning, he left, not far, just beyond the last hut, just far enough to sit on the ridge and watch the wind move across the plain. The wild wouldn't return. He knew that now, and he wasn't sure if he could return either, because something in him had been shaped for movement, for blood, for silence that waited to break. But now the silence was different. Now it belonged to the fields. And so he stayed on the ridge, neither leaving, nor returning, just watching, as the village below grew, and the wild within him slowly faded into memory. The first roof, and the first fence. The sky had always been enough. When it rained, you waited. When the wind grew sharp, you leaned into it. You had always lived with the sky open above you, not as a threat, but as a reminder that the world was bigger than you, that your place in it was to move, not to stay. But then the rains came too early, then again too long, then again too cold, and this time you had nowhere else to go. The shelter you built wasn't much. Branches lashed tight, layered with bark and grass. No walls yet, no true shape, just coverage. Enough to keep the cold from cutting through at night. You sat under it the first evening, listening to the rainland above, instead of on you. It felt wrong, safe, but strange, like you had cheated the season somehow. You told yourself it was temporary, just until the sky cleared, just until the trail dried, just until you could move again. But the trail didn't dry, the river swelled and blocked the pass, and the grain you'd planted just beyond the ridge was finally starting to sprout, so you stayed. You rebuilt the shelter, this time with walls, not high, not heavy, just enough to hold in warmth and hold out wind. You shaped the door low, so the smoke from the fire inside would rise and slip through the back wall, where the thatching thinned. You added a place to store tools. You packed clay into the corners to keep insects out, and you realized, one morning, that you had begun to forget what it felt like to sleep beneath the stars. The fence came later, not for animals, not yet. At first it was just a boundary, a ring of broken branches, loosely tied, circling the new grain plot to keep people from stepping where they shouldn't. A simple thing, a suggestion, not a rule, but it changed something. Before the fence, the field had been part of the land, open, shared, the wind moved freely across it, and so did you. After the fence, it was yours. You didn't think of it as ownership. You didn't have a word for that yet. You just knew that the space within the fence needed you, and you, in turn, began to need it. You checked the gate every morning. You watched the sky differently now, not to track the herds but to count how many days until the grain would need water. You stopped walking as far. Your world, once stretched across valleys and ridges and hidden trails, had shrunk to a few paces of tilled earth and a square of shelter with a smoke-darkened ceiling. And you didn't resist it. You began to call it comfort. The first time someone asked permission to enter your field, you hesitated. Not because you didn't want to share, but because something in you bristled. The field was tied to your work, your time, your survival. And without thinking, you said, "Step around." The words felt strange in your mouth, but no one questioned them. By the time the first animals came, goats, not yet tamed but willing to linger, you had already built a second fence, smaller, tighter, designed not to keep the world out, but to keep something in. And as they nuzzled the grass and stayed near the firelight at night, you realized this was what stillness could offer. Not just protection, but possession. You stood one evening on the edge of it all, roof, fence, field, smoke, and tried to remember how you had lived before. It wasn't that you missed it, exactly, it was just that no one had told you what you were giving up. When you built a roof, you stopped needing the sky. When you built a fence, you stopped trusting the land. And once the world was no longer open, you no longer were either. The trap that looked like home, it didn't happen all at once. That was the cleverness of it. There was no single day when the wild stopped calling, or when the people stopped listening. No moment when you stood at the edge of the forest and said, "We will not return." If it had come with a choice, it might have been easier to see, but it came with a roof, and warmth, and the soft hush of a sleeping child. It came with something that looked like home, and that was how it held you. At first, it felt like safety. The huts ringed close together, their fire pits always lit, their walls thick with clay and reed. You could hear your neighbors at night, soft laughter, the shift of limbs, the creak of beams settling into the earth. The sounds reminded you were not alone. No more wind-stung ridges, no more waking to claw tracks near the sleeping skins, no more counting how many arrows were left. You didn't need to watch the tree line anymore. It watched you, because now there were fences, and fire, and order. And that was the first part of the trap. You didn't know you were giving up freedom. You thought you were just choosing rest. You told yourself the village was a beginning, but it was also a boundary. After a while you noticed something strange. The children didn't wander, not far. They played near the wells, near the drying lines, near the loops of bark strung from poles to mark which houses held the newborns. They didn't go past the fields, they didn't follow the old trails, not because they were told not to, but because they didn't see why they should. And in their eyes you saw something both comforting and unfamiliar. They weren't afraid of the wild, because they didn't remember it. The walls grew higher. A simple thing, really. The elders said it was to keep the goats from wandering, then the wind, then the strangers, then just in case. The gates weren't locked, not yet, but they became narrower, not so easy to walk through without noticing. And you stopped noticing when they did. One evening, someone returned from the woods, mud on their legs, brambles on their cloak, the wide-eyed look of someone who had slept beneath stars. They stood in the fire circle, holding a rabbit still warm from the kill, and the village went quiet. Not out of fear, but out of distance. It was like watching an echo, like remembering something you hadn't thought about in years, and not knowing if it was real. No one reached for the meat. They had bread. They had porridge. They had peace. The wild had become excessive. Beautiful, maybe, but unnecessary. Later that night, you sat by your doorway, staring at the soft, perfect rows of sprouting grain. The wind didn't carry scents anymore, just dust, just cooking smoke. Just the low hush of regular, expected things. You should have felt proud, but all you felt was still, not calm, not content, just still. Like the trap had already closed, and you'd only just realized it had teeth. That was the thing about this kind of trap. It didn't hurt, it didn't bleed, it didn't catch you all at once. It offered comfort first, then pattern, then memory. And by the time you missed the wild, you couldn't remember how to return to it. Why the spirits stopped visiting. They used to come often, not every day, but often enough that you never doubted they were near. The spirits weren't something you summoned, they were something you noticed. A sound in the trees that didn't match the wind, a line of stones no one remembered placing, a shape in the fire's edge that spoke not in words, but in knowing. You didn't fear them, you fed them. Bits of marrow, steam from fresh broth, crushed herbs scattered over coals. In return, they gave signs. Not always clear, but always there. They told you when to move, when not to follow a trail, when to leave a place, even if it still had food. You didn't question it. You just listened, until they stopped coming. At first it was subtle. You missed a sign, a flock flew wrong, a stone cracked the wrong way when you heated it for cooking. Someone dreamed of fire 3 nights in a row, and no one knew what it meant. Then the dreams stopped altogether. The trees no longer leaned in the wind when you asked a question. The animals didn't hesitate when crossing a path. The fire burned flat, quiet, colorless. You told yourself it was the season, or the weather, or your own forgetfulness. But deep down you knew they were gone. Someone said the village had grown too loud, too much smoke, too much stone, too many things that couldn't be carried. The ground was crowded with walls and bins and clay ovens. You didn't move anymore. The earth beneath you had begun to grow tired of your weight. The spirits had always been wanderers. Now they had nothing to wander through. You called them once. You stood in the clearing outside the fence and burned cedar bark like the elders used to. You sang an old tone, half hum, half breath. You waited until the stars turned overhead. Nothing came, not even the wind. You wondered if they had left because they were angry, or worse, because they had forgotten you. The children asked who the spirits were. Once, you told them carefully. About how the world had once spoken in signs, how the river had moods, how the forest had memory, how the air itself sometimes pressed against your skin when you were about to make a mistake. They laughed, not cruelly, but with the kind of laugh that says that isn't how things are now. The truth was harder to face. The spirits hadn't left you. You had left them. You stopped needing their guidance when the fields began to grow. You stopped offering when the stores stayed full. You stopped asking questions when your days became predictable, and the spirits, never ones to fight for attention, simply faded. That was their nature. They were presence, not permanence. You had built a life they could not enter, so they turned away. Now the nights were quiet. Not just without sound, but without possibility. No more footsteps that weren't yours. No more dreams that didn't belong to anyone. No more sudden stillness that made your skin prickle. Just routine, warmth, order, silence. You had created a world that needed no spirits, and now you lived in it. The slow war between family and clan. The first cracks didn't look like cracks at all. They looked like pride. A father standing a little taller beside the plot he'd cleared alone. A mother gathering her children nearer to the hearth she'd built with her own hands. People began to refer to things as ours, not theirs, and not everyone's. At first it felt harmless. Everyone still shared meals, still sang around the same fire, still traded meat for bark tea and polished stone tools. But something under the surface had changed. You felt it in how people began to mark their walls, not with words, those hadn't come yet, but with scratches, painted shapes, worn grooves in wood, symbols that didn't mean much to outsiders, but meant everything to those who lived inside. This was the beginning, not of a fight, but of a forgetting. It had always been clan first. You didn't survive out here alone. You needed people to watch the fire, to carry water, to notice the patterns you missed. No one held knowledge alone. The elders didn't just tell stories, they protected the balance. And the balance said, you are not yours, you are ours. But when the land began to hold steady, people did too. With steadiness came memory, and with memory came lineage. Now people remembered whose child belonged to whom. Not just to know, but to compare. One boy grew taller, another ran faster. Someone whispered, his father was the same, and that was all it took. Suddenly people began to expect more from their own, and less from others. The shared hunt became 2 groups, then 4, then none at all. One family had a better seed yield that season. Someone else claimed their corner of the river as theirs alone. They weren't angry. They were preparing. The elders noticed, but they were tired. Their stories still had weight, but only in the evenings. The rest of the day belonged to the new generation. People who had only ever known the stillness of this place. To them the village wasn't a stop along a greater path, it was the path. They didn't remember when food had to be chased, when shelter was found, not built, when survival required the whole, and so without intention, they began to draw lines where there had once only been firelight. The first true divide was small. A child was accused of taking from the wrong basket, dried grain, not meat, which mattered more now. The mother protested. The other family tightened their fence. Someone else muttered that maybe food should stay within blood. No one shouted, no one fought. But the air changed, and it didn't change back. The children learned the names of their own lineage before the names of nearby rivers. They stopped using we when they spoke of harvest. They began to mimic their parents' tone when speaking to cousins who lived in the next hut. Soon people no longer sat together in one ring at night. They built separate fires. The village didn't grow apart, it folded in. Each family became its own world, their own tools, their own debts, their own silences. It wasn't hatred, it was insulation, protection, stability, control. You couldn't risk sharing too much, in case next season was worse. In case water ran low. In case something you didn't plan for came out of the woods after all. The wild had taught you to lean on each other, but the village taught you to hold on, tightly. Even if it meant holding something between yourself and the others, the clan still existed. But only in memory. Now it was family that fed you. Family that buried you. Family that remembered, and that remembering came at a cost. Because once you remember who belongs to you, it becomes too easy to forget everyone else. Tools for jobs no one chose. No one remembered who made the first one. It wasn't sharp. It wasn't beautiful. Just a flat stone tied to a crooked handle with woven fiber. The kind of tool you didn't brag about. The kind that stayed behind when the village moved. Except now, of course, the village didn't move anymore. It was for digging. Only digging. And once it existed, it stayed needed, because someone had to use it. There was a time when work had rhythm. You moved together, gathered together, cooked, carried, fetched water together. If something needed doing, the nearest hands did it. The work wasn't owned, it was shared, but the stillness changed that. Now the work didn't drift, it stuck. The digging tool lived in one hut, the firewood axe in another. The pestle stayed with the woman whose knees had begun to swell and crack from long hours grinding. She was good at it. Everyone said so, she didn't say much herself, and no one offered to take over. There was no ceremony to it, no rule that said you were the water carrier, or the ash scraper, or the one who gathered animal dung for the fire. It just happened. One day you were the person who did a thing because no one else was doing it, and then, quietly, it became yours. The basket you carried became shaped to your hand. The tool you used stayed near your sleeping mat. People stopped asking if you needed help. They just started saying thank you, and then they stopped saying anything at all. It wasn't punishment. It was survival. But it didn't feel like freedom, because the work didn't ask if it made you happy. It asked if you were good at it. And if you were, if the fields grew better under your care, or the bones cracked cleaner in your hands, then the work chose you, not the other way around. There was a boy once who carved beautifully, not for need, for joy. He would sit by the edge of the village, shaping antler and bark into tiny creatures, some real, some not. They looked alive. People admired them. They called him clever. Then, one day, they asked him to stop, not cruelly, just practically. They handed him a dull blade and asked if he could shape digging sticks instead. Something useful, something needed. He said yes. And after a few seasons he stopped carving anything else. Not everyone complained. Some found comfort in repetition, in knowing what was expected, in waking each morning and seeing your tools right where you left them. There was safety in predictability, but also weight, because when the sun rose you knew exactly what the day would ask of you, and it would ask the same thing tomorrow, and the next day, and the next. The tools got better, sharper, heavier, shaped not just for tasks, but for specific hands. A hammer that only one man could lift, a spindle so fine it only answered to one woman's touch. The tools began to know their people, and the people in turn began to feel known only by their tools. You still shared stories around the fire, you still laughed, but when someone reached for a tool that wasn't theirs, there was a pause, a glance, a moment of recognition that said, "That's not for you anymore." You had a role now, and the work remembered. No one chose these jobs, but someone had to carry them. And once you did, once the tool shaped itself to you, it was no longer just work, it was who you were. The birth of the word mine. At the beginning, words were for things you could see: fire, rain, stone, tree, mother. Simple sounds, shared understandings. You didn't need many, a gesture could still say what your mouth couldn't. A look, a pause, the rhythm of your step, all part of the language that kept people alive. But as the village grew, as the days stopped changing, as the world became less about chasing and more about keeping, new words began to form. One of them was mine. It didn't arrive with a shout, it came in a murmur, a correction, a clarification. "That's mine," a child said one morning, pulling a clay pot away from another. The pot wasn't special, just a cup, but it had been shaped by a mother's hand and painted with a thumbprint only she used. The child had watched that, had seen the care, the repetition, and in the small mind of someone still learning the weight of words, the idea settled in. This cup is different. This cup belongs. This cup is mine. No one corrected her. Why would they? After all, the cup had come from her family's hearth. It had not been traded. It had not been given. It sat near her bed each night. She drank from it, no one else. And so, the word stayed. Others began to use it too. First for tools. "This is my digging stick. That's my cord." Simple claims, understandable. You didn't want to lose track of what you'd shaped with your own hands. You didn't want someone walking off with the bone knife you'd napped under moonlight. But something shifted after that. People began to say mine, when speaking of land. "This is my field. That's our plot." Not just the things they made, but the ground itself. The place the grain grew, the bend in the river where the water ran clearer, the grove with softer leaves. It was subtle, but it spread. The word didn't mean greed. Not at first. It meant memory, effort, attachment. It meant, "I did something here." It meant, "Don't forget that." But the earth didn't remember. So people did it for her. They drew lines. Not with rope, with habits, with footpaths and fence stakes and knowing glances, and the word mine became part of how they moved through the world. There was an old man who used to speak only in stories. He didn't care for the new ways. When someone said "my fire," he laughed. "No one owns flame," he said. "It eats what it pleases." But later that night, he came to the central pit and found someone had taken the kindling he'd left stacked nearby. He didn't say anything, but the next day he made a smaller fire, closer to his door, and he sat by it alone. The hardest part wasn't that people claimed things. It was that they began to feel separate because of it. Separate homes, separate food, separate worries. What once had been ours became theirs, and what was mine became worth protecting. Not from animals, but from each other. The word spread quietly. It helped people build things, but it also made them smaller, made the village quieter, less curious, more careful. The fences grew taller, the paths between homes wore deeper grooves, and the fire at the center of the village burned lower, less often, because now not everyone came. Some had their own hearths, and their own reasons to stay near them. No one meant for it to happen. No one said, "Let's divide." They just started using a word, one that meant, "I care for this," and over time, came to mean "stay away." The quiet tyranny of routine. You didn't used to count the days, not exactly. Back then, time moved with the animals, with the thaw of snow, the buzz of insects, the drying of certain leaves. You knew when to move, because the world told you. You knew how to live, because the moment asked it of you. But in the village, the world didn't ask anymore. It repeated. You woke before the light touched the ground, not because you wanted to, but because you always did. The body remembered, even when the mind didn't care to. You pulled open the reed curtain of the hut and stepped outside, the same path, the same chill, the same sound of someone further down grinding grain with a flat stone, steady and dull, like a heartbeat you didn't ask for. A few steps later, your hands were in the soil. not because it needed you, but because this was the time of day when you did this thing. Every day, always. It had started as survival. Rhythm gave you food, water, warmth. The more you repeated, the more secure things became. But the more secure they became, the more the repetition owned you. You weren't alone. The whole village had begun to move like clockwork. The same man fetched water from the same bend in the river. The same woman laid fish on flat stones to dry at the same hour. Even when the clouds hung thick with rain, children were sent out to gather brush, not because there was none left from yesterday, but because that was what children did before the midday meal. No one questioned it. Not out loud. Once, a boy forgot to light the morning fire. He'd slept late. Cold wind, maybe. Bad dreams. No one blamed him. Not really. But when people woke and the fire wasn't lit, there was confusion. They didn't say they were angry. They said, "It wasn't how things are done." He apologized, lit it twice the next day, and the day after that, he woke earlier than anyone, just to be safe. The comfort of routine had become something else. It had become a law. Not one written down, not one even spoken, but a law just the same. A set of invisible ropes tied around everyone's movements, tugging gently but firmly, day after day. Do this now, not because it matters, but because it's what comes next. Someone once suggested doing the work differently. It wasn't rebellion, just curiosity. She said, "What if we started the drying earlier? What if the grain sprouted better in a different patch?" People nodded politely, then kept doing it the old way. Because change, even good change, disrupted the rhythm, and rhythm had become safety, but safety has a price. You began to lose the edges of yourself, the parts that asked why instead of when. You didn't wonder anymore what lay beyond the far ridge, or what might happen if you skipped the morning task, just once. You didn't ask what was possible, you asked only what was expected, and slowly, without meaning to, you became someone you wouldn't have recognized seasons ago. Not worse, not broken, just smaller. That's the tyranny of routine. It doesn't need to threaten you, it doesn't need to hurt you, it just needs to promise peace. And in exchange it will take wonder, it will take risk, and eventually, it will take the part of you that used to follow the wild. When memory became myth, it started with a child asking a simple question: did people really used to sleep in trees? You heard it while repairing a broken fence near the edge of the field. The boy wasn't speaking to you, he was asking his grandfather. The old man sat cross-legged with a worn stick in his hand, tracing absent patterns into the dust. He chuckled softly and said, "We did. Once, when the cats hunted at night." The boy's eyes widened, but he didn't ask anything else. He didn't need to. The story wasn't about danger, it was about distance. Something long gone, something too old to feel real. You paused for a moment, listening, then you kept working. There had been a time, not that long ago, when sleeping in a tree had been second nature. Not brave, not strange, just smart. You remembered choosing branches based on the wind, wrapping your leg through a crook, so you wouldn't fall in your sleep. Listening to the sounds below, breathing, cracking, howling. None of that had been myth. It had just been life. But now it sounded like a story, and not even a believable one. Over the seasons, more of the old stories had begun to change. They weren't forgotten. Not exactly, but their shape had shifted. A tale of a woman outrunning a pack of wolves had once been a warning, about how to read the wind, how to move without rhythm, how to use rivers to hide your scent. Now it was told with flourishes, with exaggeration. The wolves had glowing eyes. The woman had wings made of deer hide. No one asked if it was true, because no one needed it to be. You'd sat around the fire one night, when a young girl repeated a story she'd heard from someone else. A tale about people who could talk to animals, who rode bears, who drank moonlight, and didn't sleep. You remembered the root of that story. You'd known the man who had once tracked a bear for 3 days straight. He hadn't ridden it. He'd nearly died killing it. But in the retelling, he had become something else. Not a man, a legend. You wanted to correct her, but you didn't, because everyone else was smiling. The elders were the last ones who knew the difference. You could see it in their eyes when someone asked about the Great Migration, or the time the river froze thick enough to walk across, or the year the fish came in numbers so high you could scoop them out by hand. They didn't laugh at those questions. They just went quiet, as if the memory was too real to cheapen, or too painful to correct, because they knew those things had happened. But no one believed it anymore. The village didn't need those lessons now. Children didn't have to know how to gut a deer, or feel the sky change in their bones. They didn't have to know how to move in silence. or when to speak to the trees as they passed. Instead, they learned how to dig furrows straight, how to tie bundles tight for storage, how to keep insects out of dried grain. It was knowledge, yes, but it was rooted in the ground, not in the world. The stories still got told, but now they were entertainment, and slowly the memory inside them began to thin. The details faded, the fear softened, the wisdom became metaphor. The night terrors that had once taught you where not to camp now had names and faces and magical claws. The elders who had once risked starvation to find new trails were now called those who walked with ghosts, and the children believed that ghosts were real, but not hunger. One morning, you woke before the rest of the village. There had been a dream. Not frightening, just strange. A memory of walking through a pine forest, alone, hungry, but somehow at peace. You could feel the cold of it still on your skin. You stepped outside and looked to the hills. They hadn't changed, but you had. You no longer belonged to that story. You belonged to this one. And maybe someday someone would speak your name in the smoke of a fire and say, "There once was a man who walked through forests that no longer exist," and no one would ask if it was true, because by then it wouldn't matter. A life traded for stillness. The village no longer needed watchers at night. There was nothing left to watch for. The predators had moved on generations ago, driven out, not with weapons, but with noise and permanence. The fire no longer burned out of fear, it burned out of habit. Still, you sat beside it some nights, alone, after the others had gone to sleep. You weren't waiting for anything, but part of you was still listening. For a branch snapping where it shouldn't, for footsteps that didn't belong, for a voice not human calling from the dark. But the night only offered stillness, the soft hum of insects, the crackle of embers, the slow, gentle silence of a world that no longer needed wildness. You once dreamed in motion. Your thoughts came in trails and maps and wind, in the shifting patterns of herds, in the changing sounds of rivers. But now your dreams came slow and small. They lived inside four walls, beside steady fields. They looked like your hut, your hands, your days, and maybe that was all right, because not every story is meant to stretch across ridges and seasons. Some are meant to settle, to root, to soften. In your final years, the children came less often. They had their own tasks, their own tools, their own routines. You watched them from the doorway, their voices lighter than yours had ever been. They would never know hunger the way you had, or cold, or motion without destination. They would never know what it meant to leave without knowing if you would return, and you didn't tell them, because they didn't need to know, because this stillness, this quiet, slow safety, was the point of all you had given up. And so, on the last morning, you woke before the light, not out of habit, but because your body knew. You stepped outside, sat near the edge of the field, watched the mist rise over the woven fences, watched the sky grow pale above a world that now lived only in circles. No one noticed you sit there, and that was all right. You had traded the path for the hearth, the wild for the known, the chase for the calm, and the life that had once moved like wind, now ended like earth, still, soft, held. Thank you for walking this forgotten age. There is no return trail. But then again, that was never the kind of journey this was.